if you bought the cheapest house in the city when you arrived, maybe in 50 years you'd appear rich as well if that suburb
Sure.
gentrifies or changes. So your point that the cities grow and a suburb that is high status now is different to what it was 50 years ago is very important to understand. And a lot of other data can be deceiving when they pull in the household incomes of everyone in a suburb and go look at the rent to income ratio, when 60% of those houses are owned by homeowners and most of them might be
Sure.
retired and on the pension, and their incomes drag the suburbs average down.
Well, if I can steal a concept from The Incredibles, yes, the animated film, if everybody's super, then doesn't that mean that no one is super? And to put it in different terms, if there's always a housing crisis, doesn't that kind of mean that there's never a housing crisis? But surely we are in a housing crisis now. The evidence is all around us. First home buyers are struggling. Property prices are hitting record high after record high. Median houses in capital cities are over $1 million. And we see enormous queues outside of every single showing for the dingiest of rental properties. The evidence is all around us that there has to be a housing crisis. And yet my next guest has a very different view on this. Cameron Murray is someone who I just met at a conference in Sydney just a few days ago. And Cameron, I've got to say, when you opened your mouth and you started talking, I thought, hang on, that sounds a lot like some of what I've had to say in the past. Cameron, welcome and thank you for coming on the Topher Project.
Thanks for having me, Topher.
Now, you're an academic. You actually know what you're talking about as compared to me. I do my research, but I don't go deep into the weeds the way that you've had to. Now, you've upset a lot of people at the conference, and you're about to upset a lot of people watching this right now. You argue that the housing crisis is, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but at a minimum overblown. Can you explain to us what is your position on the housing crisis? And then for the viewers that are going to sit there objecting, just trust me, we're going to dive into the details and have a look at why Cameron has the position he has. Cameron, what do you think of the housing crisis?
Yeah, so I think the term is very bad to describe what's happening. So I think the word housing cycle might describe it a lot better. It's true that in 2026, it is historically expensive to buy a house, but that wasn't true just a few years ago. And as you said in your introduction about the accessibility of home buying for median Sydney income earners, that has changed dramatically in just a few years. And that is a common thing historically. Look at the 2000s, right? The US, there was a global housing boom and it became very expensive. I remember having a 9% mortgage interest rate just before the financial crisis, and that was an exceedingly difficult time to buy. And then in the late 80s, prior to the 90s recession, was another exceedingly difficult time to buy. And you know, for your viewers out there, you know, my favorite quote comes from a visitor to Sydney describing the housing market, and they wrote in their diary on the first day they visited that the number of large homes recently built and others finishing is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. But that was actually Charles Darwin in 1836, when the population of New South Wales was 19,000 people.
I'm sorry to interrupt my interview with Dr. Cameron Murray. We'll get back to him in just a moment, but my name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and this is what I do. I bring you news, stories, perspectives, and interviews that you probably won't hear anywhere else. And Dr. Cameron Murray certainly cuts across the grain for a lot of people, but honestly, as you start to dive into it, I think he's got a very good point. I am 100% viewer supported. What I do here, I don't get any government money. I don't get any political party money. I don't get any lobby group money. I don't even have advertisers or sponsors. I'm entirely funded by you guys. So if you appreciate what I'm doing here at the Topher Project, then please help me to keep going by buying me a coffee via the button that you'll find at topherfield.com. And of course, if you click in the link in the description, you'll find my best-selling books, my multi-award winning DVD, all of my merch in hoodies and t-shirts, caps and stickers. And you'll also find the early bird special for the Getting Your Head in the Game Master class. Check all of that out via the link in the description. And without further ado, let's get back to Dr. Cameron Murray.
So we've had these cycles for 200 years, and we're in a cycle, and we've tried to make home buying more expensive by raising the interest rate since COVID, and now it is more expensive, and now we're off looking for other non-cyclical factors that just aren't there, because it was a cheap time to buy 7 or 8 years ago in most cities in Australia, and now it's an expensive time. So if you're looking for an explanation, it has to explain both being a cheap time to buy in 2019 to 2022 and an expensive time today. And the explanation for that is we're in a cycle.
Okay, there's a lot of people listening, though, who aren't economists, and they're going to sit there going, how can you say that 2019 to 2022 was a cheap time to buy? If you just simply look at the capital value of houses, it seems to have been climbing pretty much relentlessly. Sure, there is variation, but yeah, you could draw a pretty good trend line through it, and it's been a pretty relentless rise. Yeah. So when you say that that was a cheap time to buy, what are you talking about?
Yeah, so just looking at this, the capital value, the sticker price is not a good way to understand if housing's affordable or not. It's the same as whether a share price is high or low. Is it a good investment? Well, you can't know from the number. A share that costs $1,000 or a share that costs 10 cents on the share market. Well, it depends what you own and what revenue you're going to get. And it's the same with housing. And we lowered interest rates in the second half of the 2010s, so you could get a 3.5% mortgage. Now, if I borrow $1 million at 3.5%, I can rent the money, equivalent to renting the house for $35,000 a year. But now, if it's 6%, it costs me $60,000 a year to rent that $1 million. So that same sticker price can be very affordable or very unaffordable. And what really determines that is the prevailing mortgage rates and the prevailing rents. And what determines rents is prevailing incomes, which have also risen a lot because of the post-COVID inflation wave. And so we can end up with, yes, it's $1 million, $1 million's a big number, but relative to the economic anchors that generate this, it's yes, it's a little bit overinflated because interest rates are up, but it wasn't just a few years ago. So the economy always has these relative price constraints in it. So the price just can't do anything. It can't just keep going up now that interest rates are up. It's more likely to start tapering off.
So there's a couple of interesting concepts you brought up there that are going to be really relevant towards the end of this interview. The first one, that you used the phrase renting the money. Now, of course, at the consumer end, we call it borrowing the money. And I think this concept of saying, well, you could rent a house or you could rent the money that allows you to buy the house is a new way of thinking about it for a lot of people. But that kind of gives us an insight to what you're talking about here, where the rental value of a home, that's essentially the return on the capital from an investor's point of view. And so as you change the interest rate price, well, someone says, I could buy that house for less than what I'm renting it for. Or if the interest rates go up, they go, well, hang on, I'd be better off renting. And so that actually has a really significant constraining effect on the capital value, I guess, of all kinds of assets.
Correct, yeah. And property is actually much more stable than many other asset classes, because if you're in the share market and you're thinking, oh, I've got Tesla shares or some software shares, your expectations of what the future incomes can be, oh, we're going to have 10% growth or 30% growth in revenues, whereas property and housing, we know rents pretty much rise very steadily with incomes across the economy. So in actual fact, property is a lot more stable in terms of those expectations of future returns than other asset classes.
Okay, so then what are some of the other factors? One of the points that I've made before that really upset a lot of people was, if you go back to the 1960s and say, well, my parents or my grandparents, they bought a house for 3 or 4 times their annual income, and they bought it in a nice part of town. I say, well, hang on, we're not comparing apples to apples, because back then it wasn't a nice part of town. They were buying on the outskirts, and they were buying maybe a 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with a toilet off the back patio. They had no air conditioning, probably no central heating. They were probably using a wood-burning stove, but they might have had gas if they were relatively wealthy. No lock-up garage. They had a carport that they added 10 years later. We're not really comparing apples to apples. But also the population and the fact that the outskirts of Melbourne and the outskirts of Sydney are now dozens of kilometres away rather than just a few kilometres away. What are some of the other variables now that are feeding into this perception that housing's just impossible to get your hands on?
Yeah, so it is a perception. So first home buying has been rising for 2 years, if you look at the finance data. And we actually had a huge first home buying boom during 2021 and 22 financial years. We had an extra 120,000 first home buyers squeeze into those years, nearly doubled. Nearly doubled the first home buying for that brief period. And it's still relatively high. The actual period of time where first home buying was very depressed was the early 2010s after the financial crisis. So I think we've got to respect the data and not sort of say people can't buy houses anymore when they are.
People are.
Um,
Yeah.
so your point about perceptions really matters, right? And a story I tell is my neighbor was a refugee from Chile 50 years ago,
Hmm.
and he bought this house in what is now a fancy suburb of Brisbane. And people always tell him, "Oh, you must be rich to own a house in that suburb." And he looks at them weirdly and says, "What do you mean? I bought the cheapest house in the city when I arrived." Um,
Sure.
uh, if you bought the cheapest house in the city when you arrive, maybe in 50 years you'd appear rich as well if that suburb
Sure.
gentrifies or changes. So your point that the cities grow and a suburb that is high status now um, is different to what it was 50 years ago is very important to understand. And I think
Mm.
we tell ourselves stories about history that it was easy. And yet I can tell you there were dozens of inquiries into unaffordable housing in the 60s and 70s. I can tell you the price of homes went up 90% in the first 2 years of the 1970s in nominal terms,
Wow.
and everyone complained about a housing crisis then as well. And so we're
Sure.
sort of rewriting history in our heads a little bit, and we do that every cycle.
Mm.
So,
So
we're in a cycle, and that's part of it, the rewriting of history.
I was surprised to learn from your talks at the conference where we met what the real history of home ownership rates actually is, because that was quite different to my own perception. And I'm somebody who lives in the data more than the majority of the average Australians. Can you just go through what's the real history of housing ownership and this idea of the great Australian dream and housing ownership being almost the right of every Aussie? What's the real history there?
Yeah, this is another one of those sort of stories we tell ourselves.
Mm.
Pre-Second World War, home ownership rates in the cities, it was higher in the countryside, partly because of the post-First World War land redistribution to soldiers
Yeah.
boosted home ownership in the regions and in the countryside. But pre-Second World War, home ownership in the major cities was around 43%. So through the whole 1800s, all the way up to the Second World War, we never got more than half of people being homeowners in the cities.
Yeah.
It
Wow.
was obviously higher in the region. What happened is during the war and after, we had massive public programs, war service homes, and public housing and rent to buy schemes that were federally subsidised through the Commonwealth state housing agreements. And that's what boosted home ownership from that 43 to 72%, which was the peak at the
Wow.
end of the 1960s. That's what did it, and that's what also did it in many countries around the world. We sort of subsidized people into home ownership after a great crisis, and now we've sort of coasted on that high level for the last 60 or 70 years.
So what's the number now then? If the peak was 72, but that was only with the aid of enormous amounts of subsidies, where are we at now?
It's 66.0. It actually increased. So that's from the 2021 census. The 2016 census was 65.6. So there was a small bump.
Okay.
And we can, that is something I predicted online, and people thought I was crazy that the home ownership rate might rise when we get the data from the next census, because I saw a couple of things happening. Firstly, after the Royal Commission in 2017, banks repriced their interest rates. So instead of investors and owner-occupiers getting roughly the same interest rate, they created this wedge. So home buyers got a lower interest rate than investors, and so that
Yeah.
tilted the favor, at the auctions to those buyers. And we saw an increase from 2017, and then of course the COVID massive spike in first home buying. So it's not unrealistic that we might even have an increase in the total home ownership rate in the country in the 2026 census that we'll complete in August this year, because the levels have been relatively elevated. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Okay, but let's come back to just the reality of anyone facing a homelessness situation, or not homelessness, that's too dramatic, but they've lost the rental home that they're in, or they're trying to move out of home. They are facing long queues. And I just want to read something here, and I don't want to get the details wrong, so I am actually going to read this. Excuse me for a moment while I bring this up. Domain in 2026 released their first home buyers report. And what they've actually claimed in that, and I've not gone and independently verified, but I trust Domain to do their jobs correctly. They've said that a Sydney couple aged between 25 and 34 who are on the median income without financial assistance would have to spend 62% of their income on servicing a house at the bottom of the Sydney market. And this compares with 31%. It would have been the number for them 5 years ago. So the claim there from Domain is essentially that the proportion of someone's income to service a loan has doubled in the last 5 years. And a lot of people watching will say, well, yes, that's what it feels like. So there's this disconnect here between, maybe there isn't a housing crisis, maybe this is just a cyclical thing, versus that reality on the ground that they're facing.
Yeah, I mean, the data in that story already says it's doubled in 5 years. So, it was cheap 5 years ago is kind of what they're implying.
Yeah.
So all of our stories about what's causing this have to explain both of these scenarios as well. So that's sort of my first point. My second point is, yes, it is expensive right now. Like, we're in a cycle, we're at the expensive part. Partly that's also intentional. Right? We raised interest rates to prevent inflation. How do we do that? We make it expensive to borrow money to buy houses. And if you don't buy houses, you don't build them. If you don't build them, you don't employ tradies whose prices are going up and buying furniture and all the rest of it. So partly, we are trying to make it expensive to prevent people buying houses right now. And when people go, oh, it's expensive to buy houses, I go, yes, don't buy them, please. If you all stop buying them, we might bring interest rates down and inflation might be under control. So, this context really matters. And I get that an individual might feel like, oh, I'll never buy a house. And I felt like that in the 2000s boom, right? So in the 2000s boom, I thought prices in Brisbane will never come down. And of course, they did for a decade, came down immediately after that. And it was one of the cheapest times to buy in Brisbane just pre-COVID. So
again,
that will happen again.
I just want to decode economist language there. When you say prices came down, you're not referring necessarily to the capital value. You're referring to the cost of renting the money, so to speak.
Both, in fact, both. So the nominal price, so the price in Brisbane from 2009 to 2019 essentially didn't move in nominal terms. We had about 25% inflation, so that's 25% down. And mortgage rates fell from around 8 point something to around 3 point something. So it was a massive, massive change, and we just forgot. We have it in mind that there's a cycle, and we remember all the upswings, and we add up the upswings on top of each other, and we forget the downswings. And that's sort of, we're in it. It's a big violent cycle we're having, but it will change in the future. And the other few tricks to remember about the data here is that the median income earner doesn't buy a house. Right? The marginal, most ready, the household that saved the most, that has optimistic expectations, who has the ability to borrow, they buy the house. Not every median 25 to 35-year-old buys a house, even when it's cheap. So those can be a little bit deceiving, those data. And a lot of other data can be deceiving when they pool in the household incomes of everyone in a suburb and go, look at the rent to income ratio, when 60% of those houses are owned by homeowners, and most of them might be retired and on the pension, and their incomes drag the suburbs average down. And then the renters are actually these young income professionals. You get a very distorted view. And I document in my book, The Great Housing Hijack, so many cases of the media just misrepresenting how the market's functioning. So you've got to keep that in mind as well.
So last thing before I let you go, Cameron, we're seeing from the Prime Minister at the moment and from lobby groups and other interest groups talk about reforming capital gains tax, the discount, the so-called discount on capital gains tax for property investment. This is allegedly going to be a way of making housing more affordable, making it less attractive to investors so that more home owners can get into the market. And obviously the focus always tends to be on first home buyers. Is this actually going to work out that way if they follow through with that reform?
Look, there might be an adjustment effect. Every time you change the relative tax or subsidy settings between first home buyers and investors, you sort of tilt the seesaw a little one way or the other. And the analogy I like is, you go to the amusement park and you've got fast pass to skip the queue, right? So you've got like two competing queues to get on that ride. And the more that you tax one queue, you make it more difficult to get in that. So if you tax investors more, and I mean the capital gains tax, it won't change the total cost of buying a house. It might just change the sticker price because some investors think that trade. So what they're doing, right, is trading off a loss in the short term against a highly taxed income for a
Hmm.
lower tax lump sum return in the future. And
That's
when
what
you
investors
change,
are doing with depreciation, yes.
correct.
Or negative
So when
gearing,
you
yeah.
change that discount, they'll be willing to make less of a loss in the meantime for that lump
Sure.
sum gain that's now more highly taxed, so they'll pay a slightly lower price. And that's just going to be like tilting the queue in favor of first home buyers. But there's a
Yeah.
finite number of them who arrive each year anyway and age into first home buying. So yes, it will probably have an effect. The sticker price
Mm.
probably come off slightly, and we might get a few extra first home buyers. But if you look abroad and if you look long term, countries around the world have very different capital gains tax systems and treatment. So in the United States, you'll pay capital gains tax on your own home, but you get to deduct some mortgage interest from your taxable income. In New Zealand, there's been no capital gains tax on your own home or your investment property.
You're right.
You name it, there's a different tax system, and everyone's having the same housing problems because everyone has that same housing financial cycles that we're in. So
Yeah,
yes, you get
right.
a short-term adjustment effect, but no, it's not like a set and forget. We're going to solve housing for 30 years type change. It's
Mm.
a very, very small temporary adjustment, which might be appropriate and good at this moment. Um, but these always come with trade-offs, and we have to decide as a community whether we want that small temporary adjustment for that long-term change to the tax system.
Yeah. Well, Cameron Murray, thank you so much for your generosity with your time. Where can people find you? You mentioned you've written a book. I find you to be a wonderful communicator. I've had light bulb moments listening to you at the conference and even now chatting with you in this interview. So I'd encourage people to find you. Where can they find you?
Fresheconomicthinking.com. Fresheconomicthinking.com is my website. Put your email in, get my newsletter. Yeah, you can
Hmm.
contact me by replying to any of those newsletter emails you get. Twitter, Dr. Cameron Murray. And the book is The Great Housing Hijack. You can find it anywhere, any good bookstore or online.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on the Topher Project to talk about the alleged housing crisis.
Thanks, Topher.
Thank you for watching my interview with Dr. Cameron Murray. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and this is what I do. I help busy people like you to cut through the crap, make sense of the nonsense, and to truly understand the world as it changes around us. And I think you'll agree that Dr. Cameron Murray helps us to understand what's going on in the housing market far better than the mainstream media ever do. I am 100% viewer supported, so if you appreciate what I'm doing and the hundreds of videos that I release every single year, then please help me to keep going by buying me a coffee via the button that you'll find at topherfield.com, and also check out the link in the description where you're going to find all of my best-selling books, my multi-award winning DVD, all of my really cool merch, including some new designs that we've only just released. So even if you've checked it out before, head back and check it out again. And of course, do have a good look at the early bird special for the Getting Your Head in the Game Masterclass. It begins next month in March 2026. And everything you buy, of course, goes directly towards helping me to keep doing what I do, releasing hundreds more videos just like this one in 2026. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. The algorithm loves you for it, and so do I. Please like, comment, subscribe, and as always, think free.